Hello and welcome to the Week 12 edition of the KAEP. I'm your host, John Gillespie, and here in the KAEP, guys, we have one promise and one promise only, and that is to make you a much smarter fantasy football player, yet a much dumber person. Guys, we have a lot to get into this week. We will break down our Week 12 matchups, look ahead to our Week 13 game of the week, and also hand our weekly awards. Then, of course, as always, in another segment, we will break down the playoff race and the quest for the cup in our other segment. But before we do, let's give a shout out to our producer, Peter Serpa. Peter, thank you for all that you do in making this podcast possible for this one and for the quest for the cup. And also, guys, you already know, let's give a shout out to our sponsor, Chicken Milk. Unleash the power of the chicken today with Chicken Milk, the nation's #1 performance-enhancing supplement on the market. As I mentioned earlier, guys, we have lots to get into, so let's dive right in with our game of the week. This came down to Monday night. What's cooking versus our defending champion Orange Crush. Congratulations to Orange Crush for pulling off the victory, 131.2 to 125.3. The champion's player of the week is Adam Thielen. No surprise here, guys. 8 receptions, 125 yards, and a touchdown to the tune of 26.5 fantasy points. He now holds the franchise record for most 100-yard receiving games in franchise history. He just beat Randy Moss's record. Very impressive by Adam Thielen. And for what's cooking, your top performer was none other than Leonard the Man Fournette. 95 yards and 2 touchdowns to the tune of 25.8 fantasy points. With the victory, Orange Crush improves to a league best 8-4. And with the loss, What's Cooking falls to 6-6. Moving on to the next game on the tally, the Chiefs versus the Stafford Infection. Congratulations to Garrett Ribble for pulling off the victory. He has a nice little winning streak going here at the end of the season. 138.1 over 109.2. Garrett, your top performer was none other than Julio the Machine Jones. 11 catches, 147 yards to the tune of 23.8 fantasy points. And for you, Pedro, your top performer was Baker Mayfield. 258 yards and 4 touchdowns to the tune of 25.9 fantasy points. Baker Mayfield has been compared to Drew Brees. Only time will tell if he will reach that peak, but that's great company to be compared to. With the victory, Garrett Ribble improves to 5-7, and with the loss, the Chief falls to 7-5. Moving on to the next game on the tally, TNNT versus ASW. This is the battle of the acronyms here. Congratulations to Riley Galloway for pulling off the victory, the stunning victory, earning her 3rd win of the season. Riley, your top performer was Andrew Luck. 343 yards and 3 touchdowns to the tune of 23.6 fantasy points. And for you, Ethan, your top performer was none other than Cam Newton, Superman himself. 256 yards and 2 touchdowns to the tune of 22.5 fantasy points. With the victory, Riley Sherman improves to 3-9, and with the loss, TNNT falls to 6-6. Moving on to the next game on the tally, Dungeon Master versus the King of the North himself. 130.4 over 105. Congratulations to you, Dungeon Master. Your top performer was none other than Amari Cooper. 8 catches, 180 yards, and 2 touchdowns down in Big D to the tune of 38 fantasy points. And for you, Kirk Miley, your top performer was Stephon Diggs. 8 catches, 77 yards, and a touchdown to the tune of 22.9 fantasy points. With the victory, the Dungeon Master improves to 7-5, and with the loss, King of the North improves to 4-8. Moving on to the next game on the tally, The Candyman versus Lady Lagsire. Congratulations to the Candyman, Peppermint Barkley, for pulling off the victory. And no surprise here, your top performer is the Wrath of Quan himself, Saquon Barkley, 101 yards and 2 total touchdowns to the tune of 33.2 fantasy points. And for you, Kamala, your top performer was Zeke the Freak Elliott for the 3rd week in a row, 121 yards and a touchdown to the tune of 25.3 fantasy points. With the victory, Peppermint Barkley improves to 7-5, and with the loss, Lady Lagsire falls to 5-7. Moving on to the final game on the tally, Lambeau Calrissian versus the Little Lamb. Congratulations to you, Lambeau Calrissian, for pulling off the stunning victory, 172.7 to 125.9. Coach Gillespie, your top performer is none other than Run CMC himself, the Great White Hype, 125 yards and 2 total touchdowns for an astounding, an astonishing, a ridiculous, a league-high 46.7 fantasy points. Christian McCaffrey has scored the highest amount since Julio Jones's 50-point game last season. What an astounding streak Christian McCaffrey is on at this point. Hopefully it keeps on going. And for you, Little Lamb, your top performer was who? Juju Smith-Schuster, 13 catches, 189 yards, and a touchdown to the tune of 37.9 fantasy points. With the victory, Lambeau Calrissian improves to 7-5, and with the loss, the Little Lamb falls to 7-5. Alright guys, that wraps up our Week 12 recap of the action in the PVFL. Now let's go to our weekly awards. First, we'll start with our start of the week, and this award goes to Lambeau Calrissian for starting CMC. As I mentioned earlier, he had a ridiculous outing, 46.7 fantasy points on 125 rushing yards and a touchdown, and 11 receptions for 112 yards and another touchdown, to that total 46.7 fantasy points. Guys, fun fact, since week 7, Christian McCaffrey is the number 1 scoring running back in all of fantasy football. You heard it here first, fellas. So now let's go to our sit of the week, and this award goes to What's Cookin' for benching Kenyon Drake. He only went off for 26.6 fantasy points on 32 rushing yards and a touchdown, and 5 receptions for 64 yards and another touchdown, as I mentioned earlier, to the tune of 26.6 fantasy points. Alright guys, that wraps up our weekly awards. Now a look ahead to week 13. And for that, guys, we have a Thursday night game. It is the Saints versus the Cowboys on Thursday night, so that's going to be a thriller there. Alright guys, that wraps up today's episode of The Cap. I will be looking forward to the quest for the cup that is right around the bend. I am your host, John Gillespie, for your weekly podcast, and I will see you on the other side.